The hospital room felt cold and distant, as if it belonged to another world and not the life I had built over decades. I lay on the narrow bed staring at the pale ceiling, trying to steady my breathing while the quiet hum of machines reminded me that my body was no longer as strong as it once had been. The doctors had explained everything in calm professional voices, telling me that the surgery was necessary and that the risks were manageable, yet deep inside me there was a fear that refused to settle. It was not just fear of pain or fear of death, it was the fear of leaving things unfinished, of leaving behind memories and responsibilities that only I understood. I turned my head slowly and looked toward the window, where faint sunlight struggled to enter through half-drawn curtains, and for a moment I wondered if I would see that sunlight again after the surgery. I thought about my home, every corner filled with stories, every drawer holding pieces of a life that had not always been easy but had always been meaningful. And then my thoughts settled on the small locked cabinet in my bedroom, the one place I had guarded more carefully than anything else. Inside it rested the heirlooms of our family, delicate pieces of gold and silver that carried not just value but history. My mother had trusted me with them, and her mother before her had done the same. They were symbols of survival, of sacrifice, of love passed quietly from one generation to the next, and I had always believed that one day my daughter would understand their worth, not just in money but in meaning. When Ariba entered the room that morning, she looked distracted, her eyes fixed on her phone, as if whatever was happening on that small screen mattered more than the moment we were about to face. I watched her for a few seconds, trying to recognize the little girl I once held in my arms, the child who used to run to me with laughter and questions, but the woman standing before me felt distant, as if time had replaced her with someone I did not fully know. Still, she was my daughter, and that bond was something I held onto even when it felt fragile. I reached out my hand, and she finally looked up, slipping her phone into her bag. As she came closer, her expression softened slightly, and she asked me if I was feeling nervous. I wanted to tell her everything I was feeling, but the words felt too heavy, so I simply smiled and said that I trusted her, and that was enough. Then I spoke about the house and the things that mattered the most. I told her to take care of everything while I was gone, and then I mentioned the heirlooms, my voice growing softer as I explained that they were not just objects but pieces of our family soul. She nodded quickly and assured me that everything would be safe, that nothing would change in my absence, and I believed her, because a mother wants to believe her child no matter what doubts may quietly exist in her heart. When the nurses came to take me to the operating room, the world seemed to move too quickly. The bed rolled through long white corridors filled with unfamiliar faces and distant voices, and I felt myself slipping into a space where control no longer belonged to me. I closed my eyes and whispered a silent prayer, not for myself but for the life I was leaving behind, for the memories I hoped would remain untouched, for the trust one had placed in the only person who truly belonged to me. The surgery itself was a blur of darkness and unconsciousness, but when I woke up everything felt different. The pain was sharp and immediate, reminding me that I was still alive, yet the relief of survival was mixed with a strange emptiness. Ariba was sitting beside me. When I opened my eyes, her posture relaxed, her attention once again on her phone. She noticed me after a moment and gave a brief smile, telling me that the surgery had gone well and that everything at home was fine. Her words were simple and reassuring, yet there was a distance in her tone that I could not ignore. It was as if she was fulfilling a duty rather than sharing genuine concern. I wanted to ask her more questions, to feel connected again, but the exhaustion pulled me back into silence, and I let the moment pass, telling myself that recovery would take time and that everything would return to normal soon. Days turned into weeks as I remained in the hospital, slowly regaining strength, each day bringing small improvements, but also long hours of reflection. I thought about the years I had spent raising Ariba after her father passed away, how every sacrifice I made was for her happiness, how every decision was shaped by the hope that she would grow into someone who understood love and responsibility. I remembered teaching her the value of honesty, the importance of respecting what came before us, yet somewhere along the way something had shifted, something I could not clearly define but could deeply feel. When I finally returned home, the familiarity of the space brought a sense of comfort. The walls greeted me like old friends, and the quiet atmosphere felt welcoming, yet beneath that comfort there was an unease I could not explain. Everything looked exactly the same. The furniture was in place, the curtains hung as they always had, and even the cabinet stood where it belonged, untouched and secure, at least on the surface. Ariba moved around the house casually, as if nothing had changed, her presence blending into the routine of daily life, yet I could sense a subtle difference in her behavior, a certain detachment that lingered in the way she spoke and acted. I told myself that I was imagining things, that perhaps the experience of surgery had made me overly sensitive, but the feeling refused to leave me alone. One afternoon, when the house was quiet and Ariba had stepped out, I found myself standing in front of the cabinet, my hand resting on the small key that I had always kept hidden for safekeeping. I hesitated for a moment, unsure why My heart was beating faster than usual, as if some part of me already knew that opening that cabinet would change something forever. I took a deep breath and unlocked it slowly, the faint creak of the door echoing in the silence of the room, and as I looked inside, everything appeared to be in place. The jewelry arranged neatly just as I remembered, yet something felt wrong, something subtle but undeniable, and in that moment a quiet realization began to form, one that I was not yet ready to fully understand, but could not ignore either, because sometimes the deepest truths do not arrive loudly. They reveal themselves in whispers and small uneasy feelings that grow stronger with each passing second, and as I stood there staring at the heirlooms that had defined my family legacy, I felt the first crack in the trust one had held so firmly for so many years, a crack that hinted at a betrayal I had never imagined and was not yet prepared to face. The afternoon felt unusually quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath while I stood in front of the cabinet trying to understand the strange unease that had settled inside me. I reached in slowly and picked up my mother's gold bracelet, the one she had worn on her wedding day and later passed to me. With trembling hands and hopeful eyes, I remembered the warmth of that moment, the way she told me to protect it not for its price, but for the story it carried, and as I held it now, something felt wrong. It was lighter than I remembered, and the texture beneath my fingers lacked the familiar depth that years of wear had created. I turned it gently, watching how it caught the light, and for the first time doubt entered my mind like a shadow that refused to fade. I told myself that I was mistaken, that perhaps my memory was failing me after the surgery, yet the feeling only grew stronger, pressing against my chest until I could no longer ignore it. I set the bracelet down and reached for another piece, a necklace that had belonged to my grandmother, its design delicate and unmistakable, yet even that felt different. The weight was off, the shine too perfect, lacking the soft dullness that time had given it. Piece by piece I began examining everything inside the cabinet, my hands moving faster, my breathing growing uneven as each item confirmed what I was beginning to fear. These were not the originals, they were copies, flawless in appearance but empty in essence. My heart pounded as I stepped back, trying to steady myself against the edge of the cabinet. The room seemed to close in around me, and for a moment I could not think clearly. All I knew was that something precious had been taken, something that could never truly be replaced. I wanted to believe that there was another explanation, that perhaps the items had been cleaned or restored, but deep down I knew the truth was far more painful. I closed the cabinet slowly, my fingers trembling as I locked it again, as if doing so could somehow protect what was already lost. The hours that followed felt heavy with silence. I sat in the living room waiting for Reba, my thoughts racing between disbelief and dread. I replayed every memory of the past few weeks, searching for signs that I might have missed, small changes in her behavior, moments where she seemed distant or distracted, and now those moments returned with a new meaning, one that I could not ignore. When the door finally opened and she walked in, her presence filled the room with an energy that felt unfamiliar. She greeted me casually, her tone light as if nothing in the world was wrong, and I watched her carefully, noticing how easily she moved, how comfortable she seemed in a space that now felt uncertain to me. I called her name, trying to keep my voice steady, and she turned toward me with a slight hint of impatience, as if she had been interrupted from something more important. I held up the bracelet, my hand shaking slightly despite my effort to remain calm, and asked her where the real ones were. For a brief second her expression froze, and in that moment I saw something I had never seen before, a flicker of guilt quickly hidden behind indifference. She let out a small sigh as if the question was inconvenient, and then she spoke in a tone so casual that it felt like a blow I did not see coming. She told me that she had sold them, her words simple and direct, as if she were talking about something insignificant. The world around me seemed to fall silent as her answer echoed in my mind. I struggled to process what she had said, hoping that I had misunderstood, that there was some mistake, but her expression remained unchanged, and the truth became impossible to deny. I asked her why, my voice breaking despite my attempt to stay composed, and she shrugged as if the reason required no explanation. She said she needed money and that the jewelry had been sitting there and used, as if that justified everything. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, not from illness, but from the weight of her words. I tried to remind her of what those pieces meant, how they were more than just objects, how they carried the history of our family, the sacrifices of the women who came before us, but she dismissed it with a wave of her hand, calling me dramatic and insisting that she could replace them with new ones. Her words cut deeper than any accusation, because they revealed a truth I had refused to see. My daughter did not understand the value of what she had taken. She saw only gold where I saw generations. She saw money where I saw memories, and in that moment I realized that the loss I was facing was far greater than the disappearance of a few heirlooms. It was the loss of something within her, something I had believed was there but now seemed absent. I felt tears rise to my eyes, but I refused to let them fall in front of her. Instead I stood there in silence, holding the bracelet that was no longer real, feeling The weight of betrayal settled into my heart. She continued speaking, explaining how she had used the money for things she wanted, her voice carrying a sense of justification that made it clear she did not regret her actions. At least not yet, and as I listened I felt a shift within myself, a quiet but undeniable change. The pain was still there, but it was no longer overwhelming. It was becoming something else, something steadier, something that allowed me to see the situation with a clarity I had not expected. I realized that reacting with anger would change nothing, that shouting or blaming would not bring back what was lost, and so I chose silence, not because I had nothing to say, but because I needed time to understand what this meant for us, for the relationship I had spent a lifetime building. She noticed my quietness and seemed almost relieved, as if my lack of reaction confirmed her belief that the situation was not serious. She moved on from the conversation, quickly returning to her routine, as though nothing important had happened, leaving me standing there with a truth I could not ignore. After she left the room, I sat down slowly, the bracelet still in my hand, and allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had occurred. The memories attached to each piece came flooding back. My mother placing the bracelet on my wrist, my grandmother telling stories of how it had been passed down through difficult times, and now all of that was gone, replaced by something empty, something without history or meaning. I realized then that the betrayal was not just in the act of selling the heirlooms, but in the way it had been done, without thought, without respect, without even a moment of hesitation. And as painful as that realization was, it also brought with it a sense of clarity. I understood that this was not something I could fix with a simple conversation or a moment of forgiveness. This was a lesson that needed to be learned, a truth that needed to be faced, not just by her, but by me as well, because I had trusted without question. I had assumed without doubt, and now I was forced to confront the consequences of that trust. As the evening settled into night, I placed the bracelet back into the cabinet and locked it once more, not because it held value, but because it represented a turning point, a moment that would shape everything that followed. And as I walked away, I felt a quiet determination begin to take form within me, a resolve to respond not with anger, but with purpose, to ensure that what had been lost would not be forgotten, and that the meaning behind it would be understood, even if it took time, even if it required difficult choices. Because sometimes the deepest betrayals do not demand immediate reaction, they demand something far more powerful, a response that comes from patience, from clarity, and from the strength to turn pain into something that cannot be ignored. That night the house felt heavier than it had ever felt before, as if every wall had absorbed the truth and was now reflecting it back at me. In silence I sat alone in my room, with the dim light casting long shadows across the floor, and for the first time since the discovery I allowed myself to fully process what had happened. Yet no tears came, no outburst, no anger that demanded to be heard. Instead there was a stillness inside me, a quiet space where pain had settled and begun to transform into something steadier, something sharper. I realized that what I felt was not just hurt, but clarity, a kind of understanding that stripped away illusions and forced me to see things as they truly were. I had spent years believing that love alone was enough to shape a person, that sacrifice and care would naturally teach gratitude and responsibility, but now I could see that somewhere along the way that belief had failed, not completely, but enough to create a gap between what I had given and what my daughter had learned, and in that gap something essential had been lost. I thought about confronting her again, about raising my voice and demanding accountability, but I knew deep down that such reactions would only create noise without meaning. She would defend herself, justify her actions, and perhaps even turn the blame toward me, and nothing would truly change. The lesson would be lost in emotion, and I could not allow that to happen. If there was to be a response, it had to be one that carried weight, one that could not be ignored or dismissed, something that would force her to face the consequences of what she had done, not through anger but through reality. And so I made a decision that night, a decision that felt both painful and necessary. I would not shout, I would not argue, I would act. The next morning I woke with a sense of purpose that surprised even me. The weakness from the surgery still lingered in my body, but my mind felt stronger than it had in a long time. I moved through the house quietly, observing everything with new eyes, seeing not just the physical space, but the life that existed within it, the routines, the assumptions, the unspoken expectations that had defined our relationship for so long. And I realized that much of what Ariba had done was rooted in a belief that everything here would always belong to her, that no matter what choices she made, the foundation beneath her would remain unchanged, and that belief needed to be challenged, not with words but with actions. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer, a man I had known for years, someone who understood both my situation and my values. When he answered, I spoke calmly, explaining that I wanted to review my assets and make some changes. He asked if everything was all right, and I simply said that it would be once the process was complete. We arranged to meet later that day, and when I arrived at his office I felt a sense of control returning to me. Something I had not realized I had lost until that moment we sat across from each other as I outlined my plan detailing the house, the land, the savings, everything I had worked for over the years, and how I wanted it to be handled moving forward. He listened carefully, occasionally asking questions to ensure that my intentions were clear and deliberate, and when I finished there was a brief silence before he nodded in understanding. He did not question my decision. He did not try to persuade me. Otherwise, he simply acknowledged the seriousness of what I was doing and began preparing the necessary documents. The process took time, days filled with meetings and paperwork, each step reinforcing the reality of my choice, and yet with each signature I felt a strange sense of peace, as if I was reclaiming something that had been taken, not the heirlooms themselves, but the meaning behind them, the respect they represented, the responsibility they carried. I created a trust in my mother's name, something that would honor her legacy in a way that could not be sold or replaced. The funds would go toward supporting young women who valued education, integrity, and family. Those who understood that true wealth was not measured in gold but in character. And as I finalized the details, I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that the story of those heirlooms would continue in a different form, one that could not be diminished by a single act of betrayal. Back at home, Ariba remained unaware of what I was doing. She moved through her days with the same casual confidence as before, occasionally asking me about my health or the progress of my recovery, but never mentioning the heirlooms again, as if the conversation had been nothing more than a passing moment. I watched her closely, noting how easily she had returned to normal, how quickly she had dismissed the significance of what had happened, and it only strengthened my resolve. I did not confront her. I did not hint at the changes I was making. Instead, I allowed her to remain in that comfort, that assumption that everything was as it had always been, because I knew that when the truth was revealed it would carry far more impact if it came without warning. Weeks passed and the final documents were completed. The trust was established, the ownership of my assets transferred according to my wishes, and for the first time since the surgery I felt truly at peace, not because the pain had disappeared, but because I had transformed it into something meaningful, something that aligned with the values I had always believed in. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the windows, I called Ariba into the living room. She came in with a curious expression, perhaps sensing that something was different in my tone. We sat across from each other, and for a moment I simply looked at her, taking in the person she had become, the distance in her eyes, the confidence in her posture, and the innocence she no longer possessed. I told her that I had made some decisions about the future, that I had taken steps to organize my affairs in a way that I believed was right for both of us. She listened with mild interest, at first nodding occasionally as if expecting to hear something predictable, something that would reinforce her assumptions about what was to come. When I handed her the documents, she took them casually, her eyes scanning the pages with a sense of routine that quickly shifted as she began to understand what she was reading. The change in her expression was gradual but unmistakable, confusion replaced by disbelief, disbelief turning into shock, and finally a realization that settled heavily on her features. She looked up at me, her voice uncertain as she asked what it all meant, and I explained it to her calmly, without anger, without accusation. I told her that the house was no longer hers, that the savings had been placed into a trust that would benefit others, that the future she had assumed was guaranteed had been redefined by the choices she had made. She struggled to respond, her words coming out in fragments as she tried to process the information, asking why I had done this, what she was supposed to do now, and I listened to her questions with the same calmness that had guided me through this entire process. Before answering, I told her that I had not taken anything from her, that I had simply ensured that what remained was given to those who would value it in the way it was meant to be valued. I reminded her of the heirlooms, of the decision she had made, and the reasoning she had offered, and then I said something that seemed to reach her in a way nothing else had. You already took what you believed was valuable. The room fell silent after that, and in that silence I saw something shift within her, not fully formed, not yet understood, but present nonetheless, a crack in the certainty she had carried for so long. And as I sat there watching her come to terms with the reality of her actions, I knew that this was not an act of revenge in the way people often imagine. It was not driven by a desire to hurt or to punish, but by a need to restore balance, to ensure that actions had consequences, and that those consequences were meaningful enough to inspire reflection and perhaps even change. And in that moment I realized that true strength does not lie in reacting to betrayal with anger, but in responding with clarity, purpose, and the courage to make decisions that are difficult but necessary, decisions that may not bring immediate comfort but ultimately lead to a deeper understanding of what truly matters. The days that followed felt different in a way that was impossible to ignore, as if the entire atmosphere of the house had shifted into something quieter and heavier, where every movement carried a sense of awareness that had never existed before. Ariba moved through the rooms without the same confidence she Once had her footsteps slower, her presence more uncertain, and I could see the weight of realization settling into her with each passing hour. She spent more time alone, sitting in silence or staring at nothing, as if trying to understand how everything had changed so quickly and yet so completely. I did not rush to speak to her or fill the space with explanations, because I knew that this was a process she had to go through on her own, a journey from denial to understanding that could not be forced or shortened by words alone. The money she had gained from selling the heirlooms was already gone, spent on things that now seemed meaningless compared to what she had lost, and that loss was not something she could easily replace or forget. It followed her in quiet moments, in the way she looked at me, in the way she avoided certain conversations, and in the way she began to question choices she once defended so easily. One evening she finally came to me, her eyes red and tired, her voice softer than I had ever heard it before, as she stood in the doorway, unsure whether to step closer or remain where she was. I watched her for a moment, allowing her the space to speak. When she was ready, and after a long silence, she walked toward me slowly, as if each step required effort and courage. She sat down across from me, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to find the words that would express what she was feeling, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a vulnerability that had been absent for so long. She said that she had made a mistake, that she had not understood what those heirlooms truly meant, and that she wished she could take everything back, but did not know how. I listened to her quietly without interruption, not because I did not care, but because I wanted her to fully express the truth she was beginning to see, without influence or guidance from me. When she finished speaking, there was a silence that followed, not uncomfortable but heavy with meaning, as if everything that needed to be said had already been revealed in her words. I asked her a simple question, one that I knew would force her to look deeper into herself and understand the true nature of her loss. I asked her if she knew what she had really lost, and she hesitated for a moment, her mind searching for an answer that felt complete, before finally saying that she had lost the jewelry. Her response was expected yet incomplete, and I shook my head gently, telling her that the jewelry was only a small part of it, that what she had truly lost was something far more significant, something that could not be bought or replaced with money. I told her that she had lost trust, the kind of trust that takes years to build and only a moment to break. I told her that she had lost a connection to her own history, to the sacrifices and stories that shaped the life she was living, and I told her that she had lost the understanding of value, not just in material things, but in relationships and responsibility, and in the meaning behind what we choose to protect and what we choose to discard. As I spoke, I could see the impact of my words in her expression, the way her eyes filled with tears, not from guilt alone, but from a deeper realization that went beyond regret. She began to understand that her actions had consequences that extended far beyond what she had initially considered, consequences that affected not just her present but her future and the way she would be seen by those who trusted her. She asked me if I could forgive her, her voice breaking as she spoke, and I took a moment before answering, because forgiveness is not something that should be given lightly or without thought. It requires honesty and a willingness to accept that while the past cannot be changed, the future can still be shaped by the choices we make moving forward. I told her that I could forgive her because holding on to anger would only harm both of us, but I also made it clear that forgiveness did not mean forgetting, and it did not erase the consequences of what she had done. She nodded slowly, understanding that what she was asking for was not a return to the way things were, but a chance to move forward with a new awareness, a new understanding of what it means to value something beyond its surface appearance. In the days that followed, I began to notice small changes in her behavior, subtle but meaningful. She started to take more responsibility around the house. She spoke with more thought and consideration, and she showed a level of respect that had been missing before. These changes were not dramatic or immediate, but they were real, and they reflected a shift in her perspective, one that had been shaped by the experience she had gone through. I did not praise her or draw attention to these changes, because I knew that true growth comes from within, not from external validation, and I wanted her to continue this path, not because she was seeking approval, but because she understood its importance for herself. Over time, the distance between us began to lessen, not completely, but enough to allow for moments of connection that felt genuine and unforced. We spoke more openly about things that mattered, about values, about decisions, about the kind of life she wanted to build and the kind of person she wanted to become. And in those conversations, I saw glimpses of the daughter I had once known, the curiosity, the sincerity, the desire to learn and grow, and it gave me a sense of hope that what had been lost could be replaced, not in the form of objects, but in the form of understanding and character. As for the heirlooms, their absence remained a quiet reminder of what had happened, a space that could not be filled by replicas or substitutes. But instead of seeing that absence as a source of pain, I began to see it as a symbol of transformation, a turning point, that had forced both of us to confront difficult truths and to grow in ways we might not have otherwise experienced. The trust that had been broken was not fully restored, and perhaps it never would be in the same way, but it was being rebuilt slowly through actions rather than words, through consistency rather than promises, and that process, though challenging, was also meaningful because it was grounded in reality rather than assumption. I came to understand that the sweetest form of revenge is not about causing pain or seeking retribution, but about allowing truth to reveal itself in a way that cannot be ignored. It is about creating space for consequences to take their course and for lessons to be learned in a way that leads to growth rather than resentment. And as I looked at Ariba one evening as she sat quietly reading a book, something she had not done in years, I felt a sense of peace settle within me, not because everything was perfect, but because we had both changed in ways that mattered. We had faced a moment of betrayal and chosen not to let it define us completely, but to use it as a foundation for something stronger, something more honest and more aware. And in that realization, I found a kind of closure that did not rely on forgetting the past, but on understanding it, accepting it, and moving forward with a deeper appreciation for the values that truly shape our lives. Because in the end, it is not the things we possess that define us, but the choices we make, the lessons we learn, and the way we choose to grow from the experiences that challenge us the most.